Science fiction ruled the 1960s, but television didn't always give it a fair shot. Networks were quick to pull the plug on some of the boldest, most creative shows of the era, sometimes right as they were finding their groove. Imagine time travel, alien invasions, and futuristic tech abandoned mid-sentence. Why did these incredible series die too soon, and which ones still haunt pop culture decades later? Buckle up, we're diving headfirst into forgotten legends. The Time Tunnel, 1966 to 1967. If you thought time travel stories peaked with Back to the Future, think again. Irwin Allen, the so-called master of disaster behind Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea and Lost in Space, unleashed the Time Tunnel in 1966. The premise was pure pulp gold. Two scientists get sucked into a swirling portal and dropped into random points in history. One week, they're in Pearl Harbor as bombs rain down. The next, they're on the Titanic, heading straight for the iceberg. The show had everything: lavish sets, clever stock footage from 20th Century Fox movies, and cliffhanger endings that guaranteed you'd tune in again. But here's the kicker. Despite its ambitious scale, the Time Tunnel only lasted a single season of 30 episodes. Why? Because network executives claimed it was too expensive and wanted to move on. Imagine axing a show that put your characters at the Alamo one week and ancient Rome the next, all while kids at home were glued to the screen. Fans were devastated, and critics argued the cancellation made zero sense. In fact, ABC promoted it heavily at first, even winning an Emmy for its dazzling visual effects. And yet, it was dumped before it could reach its full potential. Today, surviving episodes still feel like an adrenaline shot of history meets sci-fi storytelling. Looking back, it's clear the Time Tunnel wasn't just canceled too soon. It was one step away from becoming a generational franchise. Star Trek, the original series. 1966 to 1969. Yes, the juggernaut itself. Today, Star Trek is practically a religion of fandom, with blockbuster films, spin-offs, and conventions drawing thousands. But here's the shocking truth. The original series was canceled after just 3 seasons. That's right, NBC decided the ratings weren't good enough, and the adventures of Captain Kirk, Spock, and the USS Enterprise were shelved in 1969. Back then, the show wasn't treated as sacred ground. Viewers trickled in, sponsors wavered, and the time slot didn't help. Fans wrote letters, tens of thousands of them, just to keep it on air for its 3rd season. But even that grassroots movement couldn't save it. NBC quietly pushed the series to a Friday night death slot where it was impossible to maintain strong numbers. And yet, here's where fate intervenes. Syndication resurrected Star Trek like no other series before it. College students and sci-fi lovers caught reruns in the 70s and turned the canceled series into a cult powerhouse. That renewed love spawned Star Trek, the motion picture, in 1979, and eventually an entire empire of spin-offs and films. The irony is rich. A show killed by ratings in the 60s became one of the most profitable, enduring sci-fi brands of all time. Every time a new Star Trek series launches, you can trace its DNA back to those 3 original seasons NBC thought weren't worth keeping. Proof that canceled too soon can sometimes be the spark for immortality. Lost in Space, 1965 to 1968. Picture this: a family trapped in the void of space, battling aliens, malfunctioning robots, and their own human flaws. That's Lost in Space, another creation of Irwin Allen. Premiering in 1965, it looked like America's answer to space-age optimism. The Robinson family set off on a journey to colonize new worlds, only to end up stranded far from home. At first, the show was serious science fiction, dealing with survival and cosmic peril. But ratings wavered, and producers leaned into campy humor. Suddenly, Dr. Smith, originally written as a traitor, became a bumbling, melodramatic comic foil. The robot's iconic "Danger, Will Robinson" line became more famous than some of the actual plots. Still, the show had heart. It tapped into America's growing obsession with space travel, hitting TV screens just as NASA was taking giant leaps in real life. Kids adored the colorful aliens and flashy sets, while adults rolled their eyes at the silliness. But here's the real tragedy. After 3 seasons, CBS pulled the plug. Was it ratings? Was it rising costs? A little of both. But canceling Lost in Space right before the moon landing in 1969 was almost comically bad timing. With just a bit more patience, the network could have ridden the wave of Apollo-era enthusiasm. Instead, it ended abruptly, leaving fans longing for more. Today, the show lives on through cult nostalgia and remakes, but the original deserved a much longer voyage. Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, 1964 to 1968. Before the time tunnel or Lost in Space, Irwin Allen tested the waters with Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. Based loosely on his own 1961 film, the show followed the crew of the futuristic submarine Seaview as they battled Cold War villains, giant undersea monsters, and occasionally ghostly apparitions. Yes, this was a show where you could go from nuclear standoffs one week to mind-controlling aliens the next. For 4 seasons, Voyage combined slick production values with utterly bonkers plots. Viewers never knew if they were getting a tense espionage story or a man-in-a-rubber suit monster fight, and that unpredictability was exactly what made it addictive. But as ratings declined in its later seasons, producers cut corners. Writers began recycling plots, monsters looked cheaper, and critics sharpened their knives. By 1968, ABC decided to shut it down. Here's the cruel irony. Even in its declining years, Voyage was still one of the few shows offering ambitious sci-fi storytelling on TV. The cast, led by Richard Basehart and David Hedison, gave it a gravitas that made even the wildest scripts watchable. But networks in the 60s weren't in the business of nurturing cult hits. They wanted instant ratings. Today, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea feels like the missing link between Cold War thrillers and sci-fi spectacle. Canceled at the height of America's fascination with the ocean and space, it deserved a far deeper run. Instead, it sank too soon, leaving fans with reruns and what-ifs. Land of the Giants, 1968 to 1970. Imagine crash landing on a planet where everything, people, animals, objects, is 12 times larger than you. That's the hook of Land of the Giants, Irwin Allen's most ambitious and priciest series. Premiering in 1968, the show followed a group of travelers trapped in this oversized nightmare. Watching humans scurry like ants beneath towering everyday objects was both visually stunning and narratively gripping. Allen spared no expense. The sets were massive, with giant pencils, enormous phones, and colossal props that dwarfed the actors. The scale was jaw-dropping for 1960s television, and the show had the potential to become a landmark. But the budget ballooned to around $250,000 per episode, an astronomical figure at the time. The result? ABC canceled it after only 2 seasons. Not because fans didn't care, but because the network couldn't justify the cost. Critics noted that the show had one of the most original premises on television, yet money trumped imagination. In hindsight, that decision feels almost criminal. Fans still talk about Land of the Giants with awe. Its visuals remain iconic, and its premise influenced countless shrunken hero stories in film and TV. But the show itself? It ended abruptly, with no real closure for its stranded characters. What could have been a sci-fi classic ended up as a fascinating footnote, canceled too soon by an industry unwilling to think big. It's About Time, 1966 to 1967. Here's one that proves the 1960s weren't afraid to get weird. It's About Time debuted in 1966, with a premise that sounds like a sitcom pitch scribbled at 3 in the morning. 2 bumbling astronauts accidentally rocket back to the Stone Age and have to live with a tribe of cave dwellers. The culture clash was instant comedy, futuristic gadgets versus clubs and spears. For kids, it was slapstick gold. For adults, it was so absurd it became oddly fascinating. But midway through, something unusual happened. Ratings started sliding, so the producers flipped the script, literally. Instead of astronauts stuck in the past, the cave family was brought forward into the 20th century. Suddenly, you had cavemen eating in diners, discovering traffic lights, and trying to wrap their heads around televisions. It was a bold twist, but it came too late. Viewers had already started checking out, and CBS canceled the series after just 1 season of 26 episodes. Here's what makes It's About Time special. It was ahead of its time in blending science fiction with fish-out-of-water comedy. It anticipated the kind of culture clash humor you'd later see in movies like Encino Man or even Blast from the Past. Plus, the theme song, catchy, goofy, unforgettable, still floats around YouTube as a relic of TV's wilder side. Would it have lasted longer if the format switch happened earlier? Probably. But instead, It's About Time remains a short-lived curiosity, proof that the 1960s could swing for the fences with sci-fi ideas, even if the ball didn't clear the park. My Favorite Martian, 1963 to 1966. Before Mork and Mindy, before E.T., there was Uncle Martin. My Favorite Martian introduced American audiences to the idea of an alien who wasn't scary, but charming, funny, and oddly relatable. Premiering in 1963, the show followed a young Los Angeles reporter who discovers his uncle is actually a stranded Martian with a suitcase full of wild gadgets and telekinetic powers. The humor came from Martin trying to blend in with human society while secretly using his powers to fix or complicate problems. His retractable antennae became iconic, popping up whenever he needed to communicate with his home planet. Actor Ray Walston nailed the part with deadpan brilliance, while Bill Bixby played the straight man trying to cover up his uncle's otherworldly antics. For 3 seasons, My Favorite Martian pulled in solid ratings. Kids loved the gadgets, adults loved the witty banter, and it became a dependable piece of CBS programming. So why did it end? Rising production costs and the network's desire to push new shows. By 1966, Martian fever had cooled and the plug was pulled. But here's the kicker. Its influence lived on. The show normalized the idea that aliens could be part of our everyday world, paving the way for decades of sci-fi comedy. Without Uncle Martin, you probably don't get ALF, Third Rock from the Sun, or even the lighter alien portrayals we see today. Canceled after 3 seasons, it was still one of the earliest examples of sci-fi becoming family-friendly fun. The Invaders, 1967 to 1968. If Paranoia had a TV show, this was it. The Invaders aired on ABC in 1967 and told the story of David Vincent, an architect who stumbles across a terrifying truth. Aliens have landed, and they're infiltrating Earth in secret. The catch? They look just like us. Only a subtle bent pinky finger reveals their identity. Week after week, Vincent traveled across America trying to expose the invasion, but no one believed him. He was the lone crusader against a hidden enemy, a premise dripping with Cold War tension. The plots mirrored real anxieties of the time, fear of infiltration, mistrust of neighbors, and the idea that power could be quietly stolen from within. The show had suspense in spades. Aliens disguised as businessmen, politicians, or even law enforcement gave every episode a sense of paranoia. Roy Thinnes, as David Vincent, delivered the role with relentless intensity, practically sweating desperation in every scene. Yet despite critical praise and a devoted audience, The Invaders only lasted 2 seasons. Why? Network executives claimed the ratings weren't strong enough to justify renewal. Fans begged for closure, but the show ended abruptly, with no real resolution to Earth's impending doom. Here's the tragedy. The Invaders could have been America's answer to Doctor Who or The X-Files years before those shows existed. Instead, it was axed before its mythology could expand. To this day, it stands as one of the most chilling examples of a sci-fi series cut down right as it was heating up. The Outer Limits, 1963 to 1965. The control voice still echoes in fans' minds. There is nothing wrong with your television set. That chilling opening launched The Outer Limits, an anthology series that took a darker, more monster-driven approach than The Twilight Zone. While Rod Serling's classic focused on morality plays, The Outer Limits dove headfirst into eerie aliens, mutated experiments, and shadowy government projects. Premiering in 1963, the show made an immediate impression. Its episodes often featured elaborate creature effects, including monsters that scared kids right off the couch. But what made it unique was its blend of pulp thrills with thoughtful commentary. Stories tackled topics like scientific ethics, the fear of nuclear war, and mankind's obsession with power. Despite critical acclaim, the series faced constant interference from ABC executives, who demanded more monsters of the week and less thoughtful science fiction. That tug-of-war between artistry and ratings eventually broke the show. After just 2 seasons, The Outer Limits was canceled in 1965. The irony is rich. Though short-lived, The Outer Limits influenced a generation of filmmakers. Its visual style inspired directors like James Cameron and Guillermo del Toro, while some of its writers later crafted stories for Star Trek. Many of the monsters, like the famous Zanti Misfits, still pop up in pop culture retrospectives. Canceled too soon? Absolutely. The Outer Limits proved sci-fi could terrify, inspire, and challenge viewers, but its own network couldn't see the value. That's the real monster of its story. The Man from U.N.C.L.E., 1964 to 1968. At first glance, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. was just another spy series riding the James Bond wave. But look closer, and you'll see why sci-fi fans embraced it. The series followed secret agents Napoleon Solo and Ilya Kuryakin as they battled the international villain organization Thrush, using gadgets that would make Q jealous. Laser rifles, mind control devices, experimental vehicles. This was espionage with a heavy dose of futuristic tech. Debuting in 1964, it became a sensation, particularly with young viewers who loved the mix of spy thrills and sci-fi spectacle. David McCallum's Ilya Kuryakin even became a teen idol, sparking Beatlemania-level fan mail. For a while, it seemed unstoppable, but the show hit turbulence in its later seasons. Writers leaned into camp comedy, trying to imitate Batman's tongue-in-cheek tone. Audiences who loved the original tension and gadgetry grew frustrated. Ratings dropped, and by 1968, NBC canceled it midway through its fourth season. Here's the kicker. Despite its uneven run, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. had a massive cultural impact. It normalized the spy-sci-fi hybrid, paving the way for shows like Mission Impossible and films like Kingsman. It also expanded into movies and merchandise, showing how a canceled series could still become a brand. Was it canceled too soon? Absolutely. With the right creative direction, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. could have lasted another decade. Instead, it remains a fascinating time capsule, a mix of Cold War paranoia, spy chic, and pure sci-fi imagination. Quark, 1967. Before Red Dwarf, before Futurama, there was Quark. In 1967, NBC tested a bizarre little pilot about a man who commanded a space garbage ship. That's right, while other series dreamed of sleek starships and galaxy-saving missions, Quark focused on a cosmic janitor whose job was literally picking up interstellar trash. The humor was absurd, self-aware, and dripping with parody. Richard Benjamin played Adam Quark, the deadpan captain of the trash vessel, constantly dealing with the ridiculous bureaucracy of the United Galactic Sanitation Federation. The pilot mixed satire of government inefficiency with classic space opera tropes. In short, it was Star Trek flipped on its head. So, why didn't it work? Timing. NBC executives weren't sure audiences in 1967 were ready for a sci-fi parody. The pilot aired, got mixed responses, and was quietly shelved. Only years later did it get revived in the late 70s as a short-lived series. But that revival came too late to truly cement its place in the golden age of 60s sci-fi. Looking back, the original Quark pilot feels like a prophecy. It anticipated the kind of satirical, genre-bending shows that would become staples decades later. Had it been given a full run in the 1960s, it might have changed the landscape of sci-fi television forever. Instead, it ended up as one of those fascinating what-if experiments, canceled before it could even begin. Mr. Terrific, 1967. Imagine Superman, but instead of Kryptonian DNA, his powers come from swallowing a government-issued pill. That was the premise of Mr. Terrific, a sci-fi comedy that aired on CBS in 1967. The main character, Stanley Beamish, was a meek gas station attendant secretly recruited as a superhero because he was the only person whose body could handle the pill's powers. Every dose gave him flight, super strength, and invulnerability, but only for a limited time. The result? A superhero who constantly had to check his watch before his powers ran out. That, ticking clock created some genuinely funny and surprisingly tense moments. Would Stanley save the day, or would the pill wear off mid-battle? The show's special effects were charmingly low budget. Flight sequences often looked clunky, but that became part of the fun. It wasn't about slick spectacle, it was about sending up the superhero craze while still delivering sci-fi flavor. Kids loved it. Adults, not so much. Unfortunately, Mr. Terrific lasted just 17 episodes before cancellation. CBS claimed audiences weren't sure whether to take it as satire or adventure, and ratings sagged. But in retrospect, it was ahead of its time. The idea of a reluctant, flawed superhero would later dominate comic book adaptations. If anything, Mr. Terrific proved the 1960s were already asking questions about what it really means to be a hero, and doing it with a wink. Cancelled too soon, it still paved the way for decades of sci-fi comedy hybrids. Captain Nice, 1967. Not to be outdone by CBS, NBC launched its own superhero spoof the exact same year, Captain Nice. Instead of a pill, mild-mannered Carter Nash, a chemist, developed a serum that gave him powers. The catch? He was clumsy, timid, and stuck living with an overbearing mother who demanded he still be home for dinner after saving the world. William Daniels played Captain Nice with a kind of awkward brilliance, bumbling through fights and mishaps in a costume his mother sewed. Unlike Mr. Terrific, which leaned more into sci-fi gadgets, Captain Nice played up family dynamics and pure slapstick. The humor came from watching a man completely unsuited for superheroics try to handle them anyway. But here's the problem. America wasn't ready for two competing superhero comedies in the same year. Viewers were already glued to Batman, and Captain Nice got lost in the shuffle. Ratings tanked, and NBC yanked it after just 15 episodes. Despite its short run, Captain Nice is fascinating as a relic of TV's experimental streak. It showed networks were desperate to cash in on the superhero craze, but also afraid to take sci-fi entirely seriously. In that middle ground, Captain Nice fizzled. Still, watch it today, and you'll see early shades of the reluctant hero archetype that dominates modern blockbusters. Clumsy, flawed, and oddly lovable, Captain Nice was canceled too soon, but in a strange way, he was ahead of his time. Journey to the Unknown, 1968 to 1969. Here's one that often slips through the cracks. Journey to the Unknown was produced in Britain, but ABC picked it up for U.S. broadcast in 1968, branding it as part of its sci-fi anthology lineup. Each episode told a standalone story, often mixing elements of horror, mystery, and science fiction. Think of it as the Twilight Zone's overlooked cousin. While it technically wasn't born in America, its U.S. airing was heavily marketed as an ABC original, complete with American intros recorded by actor Sebastian Cabot. That makes it a legitimate part of the 60s U.S. sci-fi television landscape. The show offered eerie tales of future dystopias, strange experiments gone wrong, and psychological thrillers that kept viewers on edge. Critics praised its boldness, but audiences didn't bite. Ratings lagged, and after 17 episodes, the plug was pulled. What makes Journey to the Unknown special today is its mood. It didn't rely on flashy effects or monsters, it built atmosphere. Its influence can be seen in later anthology revivals, from Night Gallery to Tales from the Dark Side. Cancelled too soon, it's now remembered as a bridge between the classic anthology era and the darker television experiments of the 1970s. Planet of the Apes, 1969. Everyone knows the Planet of the Apes films from the 1970s, but few realize the idea of a TV series was being tested even earlier. In 1969, Fox commissioned an unaired pilot exploring the ape-controlled future. The footage featured early test versions of the ape makeup and world building that would later explode into a blockbuster franchise. The pilot never aired, and the project was shelved. Executives claimed audiences wouldn't buy into the premise for a weekly show. Ironically, just a few years later, Planet of the Apes became a cultural juggernaut on the big screen, proving those same executives completely wrong. Clips of the pilot have since surfaced, and while rough, they show how ambitious the series could have been. Imagine a serialized exploration of humanity's downfall years before apes became a household name. Instead, the 1969 project was canceled before it had a chance. In many ways, this pilot is the perfect symbol of 1960s sci-fi television. Bold ideas, half-formed execution, and executives too nervous to take a chance. If the show had gone forward, it might have changed the entire trajectory of the franchise. Instead, it became another entry on the long list of canceled too soon gems. So, there you have it. 15 sci-fi series from the 1960s that flashed bright, then vanished way too fast. Some were expensive experiments, others victims of bad timing, but all of them dared to dream big. Which one do you think deserved a longer run? Drop your pick in the comments below. And if you're hungry for more forgotten gems, hit subscribe, share this with your fellow sci-fi fans, and keep your eyes open, because the past still has stories left to tell.